We continue to follow breaking news in that civil court case against former President Donald Trump. The judge, Arthur Engoron, has imposed a penalty of more than $350 million against both the former president as well as his adult sons and his corporation. That case brought by New York Attorney General Letitia James. The former president has been ordered now to pay more than $354 million in damages. It's believed that he needs to pay that amount in the next 30 days. His co-defendants are being ordered to pay another $10 million in fines. Meanwhile, the judge also imposed other penalties banning the former president from conducting business in the state of New York over the next 3 years. And his sons, Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., are prevented from serving as an officer or director of any New York corporation for the next 2 years. Now, as we've reported, that sum, north of $350 million, will need to be paid by the former president. And both Eric and Donald Trump Jr. have each been ordered to pay a little bit more than $4 million each. We also want to tell you about former Trump Organization CFO Allen Weisselberg. He's been ordered to pay $1 million. CBS News legal analyst Rikki Klieman joins us now. Rikki, always good to talk to you. So I want to get your take on this question I've been pondering. What do you think is the bigger penalty that's more impactful to the former president? This $354 million judgment against him, or these other bans, the inability to conduct business in New York for the next 3 years, the inability to even secure loans from any institution that is based here in New York?
I think the injunctive relief, which is what you are referring to, the inability to be an officer or director, the inability to do business within the state of New York, in the end is far more impactful. And the reason I say that is because the essence, the center of the Trump business real estate empire is in New York. And this is really putting him, and perhaps in his mind, almost far more important, putting his sons out of business in their prime of life. And so what are they going to do? The money, which is a staggering sum of money by any scale, on any scale, is something that they had to expect because Letitia James, the Attorney General, had gone from $150 million into the twos, up into the threes, up to $370 million. So when you get to $354 million, you are talking about a sum of money, the likes of which almost no one or no company sees in terms of a penalty. The money, which I know it has to be posted, it's one thing to say it has to be paid within 7 days. It's a whole other thing to say, how does the legal process work? He has a right, as does the organization, as do the other people who were sanctioned by the judge's decision. They have a right of appeal. And in the process of filing for an appeal, it's not that they have to pay the judgment. They can ask that the judgment be stayed pending that appeal. But in order to go forward with an appeal in the state of New York, you have to post the money, or you have to post a surety bond. This is not going to be easy under any circumstances. Donald Trump must appeal because he needs an appellate tribunal to be able to look at this amount of money and decide if it is too punitive in nature and should be reduced.
So, Rikki, on that, I understand $350 million. The mind boggles thinking about that amount of cash. But when you look at the Trump Organization and the massive holdings that they have, couldn't the former president just say, Mar-a-Lago, Trump Tower, this is my guarantee? Why is it actually going to be that difficult for him, or might he actually have to sell any of his properties or holdings?
Well, if in fact at some point in the future he actually has to pay this amount of money, or the organization has to pay, it would seem that some of the holdings would have to be sold. Now, you're also dealing with the fact of looking at the properties within New York and the fact that the judge has wanted no business done by the Trump Organization. So who going to manage this kind of a sale? there are all kinds of open questions here. You also have to remember with Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago is a club. Mar-a-Lago has a restrictive covenant, meaning that in the deed to Mar-a-Lago, as it exists today, it cannot be sold at this point in time with that restriction to become something that is a residence. So it would have to be sold as a club. We don't know how this money is going to be raised. And I'm not saying it's going to be raised to pay off a judgment. I'm saying it's going to be raised in order to post money for an appeal or collateralize, give collateral to a company that would be willing to take a surety bond. That's a risky surety bond if, in fact, what you're asking for collateral to say, okay, I'm going to get paid one way or the other, if at some point that has to be sold. So this is a conundrum.
Yeah. Rikki, having had an opportunity to look through the judge's report here, I think it's about 90 pages. What jumps out to you, and what areas do you think that the former president may still have available to him in terms of trying to mount a successful appeal?
Well, former President Trump has said from the very beginning of this case that he found that the judge was biased against him. He has gone on social media. He has said things outside the courtroom about his perceived bias on the part of Judge Engoron. One of the reasons that Donald Trump has available to him is that the judge, in fact, decided that there was fraud on the paperwork before he held a trial on what the remedy would be. And so it becomes, looking at it from the point of view of either Donald Trump, his lawyers, or those who are upset about this kind of a judgment, that what they would say is like Alice in Wonderland, it's first the verdict, then the trial. And that's a paraphrase of Alice in Wonderland, which is first the sentence, right, then the trial. But what you have is the reality for Donald Trump is to say, there was no way I, Donald Trump, could get a fair trial from this judge who had already been decided, who had already made a decision against me, so that the trial was nothing but a show trial, according to the defense, in order to exact the maximum penalty. So there are reasons that Donald Trump can go up on appeal. In addition, the Associated Press made a study of this particular law and how it is used in the state of New York. And when it studied over 70 cases, there was no case that found that a business would really have to dissolve when there was no victim that said that they were victimized or did not get their money back. So this case stands on its own. An appellate court is ultimately going to make a decision as to whether this remedy is out of control, over the top, according to the defense in its appellate brief, I assume, because there's never been any other company that did not create victims that really suffered that would have that kind of a penalty. The court may say that this penalty is too much, or the appellate court may say this was a pattern of activity of deception and fraud. It remains to be seen.
And on that, I want to bring up the statement that we got from the Trump Organization. They wrote, "Today's ruling is a gross miscarriage of justice. Every member of the New York business community, no matter the industry, should be gravely concerned with this gross overreach." And we also heard from Trump's lawyer reacting to this statement. She wrote, "This verdict is a manifest injustice. Given the grave stakes, we trust that the appellate division will overturn this egregious verdict and end this relentless persecution against my clients." All of that, of course, underlying, as you were explaining, Rikki, the contentious relationship that the former president had at times with the court, and that gag order, for example, that was imposed on the former president. Now that the judgment has been issued, what happens with that gag order? Does that go away at this point?
Well, it's a good question, because Usually, a gag order is for the purpose of the trial up to the point of a verdict, or in this case, a judgment. However, there was another purpose involved with this particular gag order, which had to do with the question of threats, not only against the judge, but against personnel in the courthouse. By all normal process, the gag order would cease. But I don't know in this particular case. It may be that the Attorney General wants the gag order to continue during the appellate process. We will see what comes to pass.
Hey, Rikki, real quick, let's talk about the fact that this was a civil trial and not a criminal trial. As such, what we're talking about are these penalties that involve the former president and his co-defendants' ability to do work here in the state, and fines that they need to pay, but it does not carry the potential for any prison time. What is behind the decision to make this merely civil, and is there the possibility that criminal charges may ever follow?
Criminal charges are not going to follow this case. The jurisdiction of the Attorney General in the state of New York is civil and only civil. The Attorney General, when she had gone through this case, basically handed it over to the district attorney's office of New York County, which is Manhattan. During the tenure of the previous district attorney, they looked at this case, and it seemed that it was possible that there was going to be an indictment in this case. When the new district attorney, Alvin Bragg, came along, he decided not to go forward with any criminal charges involving these allegations, and instead he chose the path of falsification of business records having to do with the allegation of paying off the pornographic star Stormy Daniels. That case is a criminal case. It is going to trial on March the 25th.
All right, Rikki Klieman, thank you so much.